Today I'm in Ann Arbor, Michigan, in the lovely home of Margaret A Leary, talking with Margaret for our history. Margaret is the retired or law librarian emeritus of the University of Michigan here in Ann Arbor. Margaret, by way of introduction, I was going to say a couple of words about the weather because we're doing this in December. It's Michigan. But
no snow, no rain,
snow,
it's wonderful, no ice,
yeah,
you've lucked out.
I've been driving around visiting
Yep.
some of our colleagues, and it's nice that you gave me such good weather.
Well, I did my best.
Very good. Well, it is customary to sort of begin by asking you a little bit about yourself as a person. Talk a little bit perhaps what your life is like now, and also perhaps years ago when you were young.
Well, I was born in Oberlin, Ohio, which is a college town in northern Ohio. It was a wonderful place to grow up because it was focused on education. It was a place where there was a conservatory as well as a very highly ranked college, and a small town that was full of many different kinds of people, farmers and professors and all different kinds of people, very eclectic architecture. So it was a really good place to grow up. I think it's at Oberlin that I learned to value higher education and where I learned to value libraries. I worked in a library when I was in first grade, and I worked in a library when I was older, and just came to value libraries a great deal. A quick example of an oddity of Oberlin is that I grew up thinking that all libraries had a children's room on the left side when you came in the front door.
Well, of course. We all
And
know that
an
well.
adult room on the right side when you came in the front door. And at Oberlin, you went up the stairs and there was the college library. And so I thought that all libraries were gradated like that. So as you got older and got more education, you could just go up to the better library. I found out not all libraries are like that, but that was my introduction.
My hopes are dashed.
Yes,
I was hoping to go up the stairway someday.
No. So that's about my younger years.
Well, you weren't exactly a job hopper when you came to higher ed and so on. You were at the University of Michigan from 1984 until you retired.
I was director from 1984 until I retired, but I came to the Law Library at Michigan in 1973, right after I graduated.
Even longer tenure.
Right after I graduated from law school. I came to Michigan as assistant director. And then I was made associate director and then director in 1984.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, in addition to work, it's customary to ask if you have any particular hobbies or passions or special pursuits, and I know you do because you described at least one of them and we were talking off camera.
Yeah.
You want to talk a bit about that?
I have done a number of things in addition to working at the law library, and then more since I retired. The things in particular that I'm interested in are housing for people who can't afford it, affordable housing. So I spent a lot of time working with Habitat for Humanity here locally. I am an elected member of the Ann Arbor District Library Board, which is a wonderful, wonderful library here in town, which has its own permanent millage. If you can imagine anything better than that.
So they don't have to go to the voters periodically to beg, huh?
Right, so that it's a wonderful library. It's a 5-star library, Library Journal 5-star library. I've also been active in other governmental organizations. I was on the Zoning Board of Appeals when I first moved to town. I spent about a decade on the City Planning Commission. I love urban planning as well as architecture. So those are some of the things I've been involved with. Right now, I'm on the board of a dormitory at Michigan called the Martha Cook Building, which was given to the university by the same man who gave all the money for the Law Quadrangle. And I'm on the board of the United Methodist Retirement Community Foundation, which is a place where older people live. It's got a full range of living arrangements for senior citizens. And I am on a couple of other boards that don't take quite so much of my time. In the past, I've served on the board of the law school where I went, which is William Mitchell in St. Paul. I would not be where I was if it weren't for William Mitchell, so I was very passionate about giving back to that school as well.
Well, it sounds like your retirement must be a fascinating adventure.
It is.
You know, people who are not yet retired often ask me,
Yeah.
you know, what am I going to do with my time? You know, I'm used to spending it all at the office.
Right.
And I say, you'd be surprised
Yeah,
how
well-
you get to the point, and probably fairly soon, that you sort of wonder, how did I ever have time to work?
Well, yeah, I actually don't wonder about that very much. What I wondered about before I retired was, who am I?
Oh,
When I disassociate myself from the University of Michigan Law School, what's left? And
that's right, you were the director, and
for a long time.
that was you.
That's right. I remember going to the last day I was at work, I went to a social event that was given by a local organization, and I hadn't thought much about it. I walk in, I get a glass of wine, and I meet somebody that I've never met before, and they say, "What do you do?" I wasn't sure what to say, and I said, "Well, actually, this is my last day," and blah, blah, blah. And I thought, I need a better answer than that. But I had planned for my retirement. I knew that I am a person who has to have an objective, a thing to get done. So a year before I retired, I applied to a graduate program at Eastern Michigan University, which is just east of Ann Arbor. And I was accepted into their creative writing program. And that's what so I started graduate school the fall after I retired. And I'm just about finished with that. I shifted over to history, and I'm just about to finish an MA in history this spring. My last class will be a trip to Rome and Florence that I do with a
I'm
professor.
envious already.
Yeah,
They're on my bucket list.
Yeah. So I'm gonna do that. So Ann Arbor is not a very big city, but it has a huge variety of people in it. And when you're working in a place like the law school, it's easy to get in your law school pool and you never get out of that pool.
Yeah.
Well, now I'm out in the ocean of Ann Arbor, and it's really fun.
Well, it sounds like some of your earlier experiences in the zoning board and so on, you've been in the ocean of Ann Arbor a bit before.
Yeah, I was.
Well, that sounds
Yeah,
wonderful.
yeah.
Well, it sounds like you are probably very much enjoying retirement.
I am.
And,
I am.
I do the same in terms of, and I find it a fascinating point,
Yeah.
time in life,
Yeah.
at least at this point.
Right,
I
right.
realize if we stay around a bit longer, we'll get older.
Right, it'll be
but,
harder.
Things may slow down, but
Right.
who knows?
Yeah.
Well, sort of on that,
Yeah.
we sort of begin to focus a little more on your career.
Yes.
You were, of course, a law librarian and a director. How was it that you decided to enter our profession? Or did someone play a role in that?
Well, when I went to law school, I went to law school at night, and I continued to work as a librarian because I'd already earned my library degree. And I went to law school in the first place because I was getting, after 1 or 2 years in the profession, very discouraged with librarianship. I really didn't think that we were doing what we ought to do. It was before catalogs got automated. And I had always wanted to have an influence on, make the world a better place. And I thought I could do that if I went to law school. So I went to law school. The last year I was in law school, I worked for the Legal Aid Society in Minneapolis. And I had a regular full caseload of divorces in the pre-no-fault era. So I had to go into court and prove up my divorces. And from that work, I got a little tiny glimpse into what practicing law would be like, and I felt like a fish out of water.
Oh.
And so the time came to look for a job, and I had several interviews, and I was offered a job with a legal aid society. But my interviews with law firms and corporations went nowhere. Well, this is 1973. There weren't very many women yet in law.
That's right.
Nobody talked me into going back to law, or back into librarianship, but my mother sent me a newspaper clipping that was an ad in the New York Times for the assistant director job at Michigan, which I otherwise would not have known about. I wasn't that tied into, and advertising in the New York Times is a little bit of an odd thing, but it's what Michigan did.
We used to do it.
National search,
Yeah.
right? So I applied for the job and I got it and decided to go to Michigan. It was is a wonderful law school. It's in a beautiful facility. It had a fine collection. I was impressed by the staff, and so I thought, I'll go, because there were a number of challenges there. They were about to build a new building that was going to be for the library. They had a fabulous collection and a great staff and a faculty that really appreciated the library, so it wasn't really hard to decide.
So you started out in legal aid for a while and found that probably interesting to a point, and you're doing, I imagine, good things as opposed to lawyers that perhaps, well, I don't know if it's the right way to phrase it.
No, I know what you mean.
Do things that they don't consider quite as good for society,
Right.
maybe.
I think I was, but the problem was my clients had gigantic problems. And one of their problems was a bad marriage. But they had many other problems, such as too many kids, not enough education, and so on. So while I was helping them, I knew that what I was doing would not fix everything in their lives. So that was a little bit frustrating. But that might have been part of the reason why I decided to be a librarian. Another factor was I was so old. I was 30. I was 30 and I did not want to be a novice. I want to go do something I kind of know how to do. So that was another reason I went back to librarianship.
Well, earlier you mentioned having once been in a public library setting and seeing the children's room on the left and the adult room on the right, and the educated folks upstairs.
Right.
Now that you're on the boards and so on, I assume you make sure all the new libraries in Ann Arbor fit that stereotypical image.
I can't do that. No, I'm not powerful enough to do that.
Well,
Yeah.
maybe you are, but you're prudent enough
not to try.
I'd like to phrase it that way.
Yeah.
You've mentioned your law degree and your library degree. Could you be a little more specific about your college work?
Sure.
And where you got the library degree?
Right. My bachelor's degree is from Cornell University, where I was a government major and a history minor. And then my library degree, which is not really a library degree, it's an MA, was at the University of Minnesota. And I got a job working in the library at the University of Minnesota and went to law school at night.
So you went to Mitchell?
I went to William Mitchell, sorry. Yes, I went to William Mitchell at night. Took 4 years.
Well, that was sort of the custom for people who went part-time. It's about 4 years.
Right. It was wonderful because it gave me a real leg up in terms of looking for a job because I decided to go back into librarianship. So I had 4 years of professional experience and a JD, which put me ahead of some of the other people who had applied for that job.
We've talked a bit about your work here at the University of Michigan, but we haven't really talked about your work, more or less what the titles were and so on. Could you tell a little more about some of the specifics of what you did? You came here as
Assistant director.
Assistant director. And you were there in that about 10 years.
I became director in 1984, and somewhere between 73 and 84 I was promoted to associate director.
Okay.
Yeah, and then I became director in 1984.
Could you talk a little bit about your early parts of that, and then perhaps a bit some of the things some of the highlights of your directorship?
Sure.
Perhaps.
When I first came, the big deal was the building of the underground, what turned out to be an underground addition to the Michigan Law Library. And so I was part of the committee that selected the architect and then worked with the architect to plan the building, where it would be and what would be in it. It was a very contentious discussion at the law school for a number of reasons. But eventually the building ended up being all for the library and being all underground. And I think it's a very successful building myself. And the library staff all moved down there, and we moved the parts of the collection that people used the most into the underground addition. So that was a really big deal. When that was finished, which was 1981, I thought a lot about the library, and I realized that what had happened was in the 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, and 60s, Michigan, and even into the 70s, the Michigan Law Library was still building its collection because it has a collection that's worldwide in scope and chronologically complete.
Very highly regarded even then, and
Right,
especially
it
now.
was. And so a lot of the work in that period of time of the librarians was building that collection. Do we have a complete collection of Cuban law? How do we get it if we don't have it? But by the time we finished the underground edition, the collection development work was finished, And it was time to turn to the next stage of the development of the library as an institution. And I decided that it was, to me, it was a no-brainer. Our role was to be partners with the faculty in getting their research done. We have this great collection, so our primary role should be helping the faculty, and we developed the faculty research service, where we have dual-degreed librarians. I believe now there might be 2 working in that. And they work hand in hand with the faculty to do substantive legal research. It's not just looking up a fact or 2, it's doing substantive legal research. So, and that model, I think, has been adopted now by many libraries. I know I did consulting work in Nottingham, England, and in Melbourne, and I visited Japan to describe this. And in Melbourne and Nottingham, they've adopted the model. So that was something that I was that's the one thing I'm most proud of in my career. We reclassified the collection. We put it into the Library of Congress classification. I know some of my colleagues who worked in younger libraries had their libraries classified from the get-go, but when you've got a collection of more than 1 million volumes, I'm very proud of the fact that I could talk a dean who was a constitutional lawyer into providing money to classify the collection. We, Google started to do our collection. You know, Michigan, the University of Michigan was a leader in the Google Digitization of Books project.
Yes.
And a number of the books in the Michigan Law Library were done, but unfortunately Google didn't get to our part of the University of Michigan until around the time they decided they didn't want to do that so much anymore. And I think they're still doing dribs and drabs.
Well, I understand they ran into some copyright concerns. And
Yes.
may have sobered them up about
Right.
some of the stuff.
And they also ran into some practical difficulties in terms of the size of the books and the nature of the copying that was required. And their machines can only do a totally standard book. If you have anything, a CCH service or anything like that, they just really couldn't do it.
So they can't accommodate the stuff on the bottom shelf. They
Right.
often portfolios and
Right,
stuff on the top
exactly.
shelf
If
and
it's-
small
if it's
stuff.
too little, right,
Yeah.
exactly.
I guess we don't arrange libraries quite that way generally anymore.
No. But anyway, those are the things that I'm proudest of in my career at Michigan.
Well, you had a long and distinguished career. I imagine being part of the campus and the campus community.
right.
Were you involved in perhaps activities outside of the library on campus?
I was, especially in the early and middle time, in my time at Michigan. I was involved in faculty governance because librarians are considered faculty at Michigan, generically speaking. And so I was involved in faculty governance in many committees, and that was good. That was a way to get to know the campus better.
That was an opportunity I had as well. And, you know, my colleagues in the law school were delighted that
To have somebody else
I'll
do it.
serve on the faculty side
Right,
for you.
right, yeah.
And yet you do meet people all over the place. And it's a nice experience.
It
I
is, it
think.
really is, yeah. Makes you appreciate the law school.
Well, and I know going into today and deciding who, you know, we like to talk to for these conversations on camera, you have a long and very distinguished
Well, you're very generous to say that.
reputation and experience in leadership of our association. And
Yeah,
some
I
of
was
the professional
president.
organizations. I know specifically you were a president of the ELL. Before that, you served on the executive board for a
Right.
separate term, as
Right,
some of us,
yep,
some do,
Yep.
not all.
yep.
That means you become an experienced
Right,
before you
right.
become president, I
Right,
think.
right, it's a good way to do it. Yeah, I was president in 88, 89. My convention was in Reno.
I remember you all came in by stagecoach.
Well,
to
what I
one of the
remember-
events.
What I remember about the Reno convention is that that was a rodeo.
Uh-huh.
And there was a significant contingent of our colleagues who felt it was cruel and horrible to have a rodeo, and that the association should not participate in such a thing. The wonderful woman, Sandy Mars, who was in charge of local arrangements, could not understand that and was extremely proud of the fact that she had put together a rodeo. The leader of the objectors was the head of the reference department at Michigan Law Library, my employee.
A colleague, in-house.
The wonderful Barbara Garvalia. And I can't tell you exactly how I did it because I don't remember, but I remember feeling very crunched in the middle of something that I didn't feel I could really control. And what we finally worked out was I explained to Barb that we can't undo this. You know, this has been decided. Not everybody agrees with you.
Yeah.
I said the same thing to Sandy. This has already been decided, but these people are objecting, and I can't change their minds. This is deep in their value system, and I can't change it. But what we worked out was that the objectors could sort of picket the event. I don't know if you remember seeing them, but they were allowed to hand out little brochures or papers that they had made, I don't remember exactly what, explaining their point of view. And the rodeo went forward. And that's my biggest recollection of Reno. My other recollection of Reno is my discovery that as president, I was in the best room in the place. It wasn't a room, it was a suite. And I was very privileged because I had one of the few clocks that exist in Reno.
That was the casino hotel, as they
Casino
are.
hotel there.
And
And they don't want you to know what time it is.
And they don't have windows, so you
Right.
can't see out. There's no
Right.
clocks, so you don't know what
Right.
time. You
Just
just
keep
basically,
gambling.
they hope
Just
will keep gambling.
Yep. And another thing I remember is that Judy Jennison, who was the executive director, I asked her to try to find a main speaker at the banquet who was an African American, and she found Ruby Dee. And that was a big hit. That was a big hit.
So that was an interesting annual meeting. I enjoyed it immensely. I have to admit, I may get into trouble because this is on camera, that I thoroughly enjoyed the rodeo.
It was a good idea.
And it was close by, it was easy to get to.
And it was very different from what we usually do.
I also had another experience. Frank Sinatra, not the son, but the original, the father, was performing there.
Oh, I didn't know
And I
that.
got to go to his show.
Oh,
And
great.
he was on stage at least 2 hours,
Wow.
no break, and it was just fabulous.
Wow.
And that is another memory of your annual meeting that I have.
So you skipped some of our meeting to go to see Frank
Well,
Sinatra?
actually,
That's
no, I
fine.
think it was at night in the
Oh,
evening. And
okay.
it was actually, I was on a editorial advisory board for a publisher, and they treated us.
Oh,
'Cause
yeah.
It was not one where we got paid as such, but they did something nice, and that
Well,
was what they did that year. for
That
us.
reminds me of something else I did as president, which was to question the wisdom of the publishers using so much money to put on the parties that they put on for us. And I talked to them and said, you know, the parties are great and we appreciate the parties, but if you could tone down the party a little bit and give us more money for our scholarship fund, we would appreciate that even more. And
Better use.
Yep, and so the parties continued, but when I found out how much those parties cost, I was appalled. And as a result of that, and I'm not criticizing anybody who did this, I stopped going to those dinners and those baseball games and everything because I realized those are being paid for with the money that the taxpayers of Michigan or the law students at Michigan provide for us to buy our collection. And we spend money on the collection, and some of that money, I mean, you can't trace it dollar for dollar, but there it is. And so I stopped doing those things. But that was just a personal choice, kind of like the people who didn't want the rodeo. You know, it's the same value judgment. But when I was trying to get the money shifted over from the parties to the scholarship fund, one of our colleagues, I believe she was in private law library work, came up to me in the hall and said, Margaret, and she got tears in her eyes, she said, Margaret, what are you doing with these parties? And I told her, and she said, the party is the only time that I feel like I'm valued.
Oh, that's too bad.
That's what I thought. That's too bad. You need a different job, maybe. But it was an experience that showed me that there's no bright line between what's right and what's wrong, what's best and what's not best. It's very blurry.
I was always a little uncomfortable too with the elaborate entertainment that was provided, at least, especially in our early days when we were not as big and the publishers were able to focus more on that kind of thing.
Yeah.
I was nervous that, you know, the word gets back to my dean or something. He might sort of start wondering, why are we sending you all of these things, you and your other colleagues in the library.
Yeah.
It didn't happen. We didn't go back and talk about that, but it was interesting.
Yeah.
And I think your focus was probably in changing the focus a little bit was probably helpful. You know, later the association, of course, no longer had some of the subsidies of the huge banquet that used to come at the end, and we changed it to a ticket event when I was in the presidential group. And that too was controversial in some circles. Some people were very much, it's about time, and others said, don't do this. So, but we figured, you know, you're going to pay for it sort of one way or another, but why not be up front?
I would agree with that.
Although we had a comprehensive kind of a registration that included it. So if you needed to slip it by back at home,
you could do that,
But it also, a lot of people didn't stay for some of that stuff. Or
I know the
it.
attendance
And
dropped
this,
off.
And this gave, even before, I mean, there were a lot of empty tables, seats. And, so I think it was probably time to rethink some of that. And you took it on. That would be a highlight, I suppose, of your presidency. Are there any other things that come to mind?
The one other thing that comes to mind about my presidency was the start, and Bob Oakley really did this. The concept was mine, but the actual action was Bob's. Was to create a role for AALL in government policy. Copyright in particular, but not only copyright. And I appointed a committee to look into that, thinking that we're librarians and many of us are lawyers, and aren't we in a position to try to influence some policy on a national level, particularly since we had so many people in Washington, just because there's so many law schools in Washington. So that was the other piece of my presidency.
It seemed to be a few of us.
Yes. So anyway, that was the other thing in my presidency.
Well, that has turned out to be quite an operation. I mean, Bob, of course, became the Washington Affairs representative, and you know, and that expanded. And of course, now he's gone, but it's continued, and they've expanded outside of Washington. I mean, they get involved in the various states. You're probably well aware of that.
No, I'm actually not. When I retired, well, I was aware when it was happening when I was still working, but when I retired, I just stepped into a different chapter of my life, different volume of my life.
Some law library type questions that we have a legitimate concern about do come up in state legislatures, and the association works, the Washington Affairs people work with some of the locals in structuring how we will respond or move to perhaps help bring those to a conclusion that we find useful, beneficial to our profession.
Right.
So they really, it's broadened beyond the confines of the District of Columbia now.
And that would have happened. I don't take credit for it. I think it would have happened no matter what, because we law librarians are in a perfect position to do that.
Yeah. And, you know, Bob's longtime assistant, Mary Alice Beige, we hired her when I was president, so I got in on the interviews and so on with Bob. And she's now the superintendent of documents, so she's moved on.
Yeah, she really did.
She's still a good friend of the association and many of us, and it's nice. Yeah. In fact, I remember years ago, Raymond Taylor.
Oh gosh,
I don't know, North Carolina, South Carolina's law librarian. He became superintendent of documents.
Yes, I remember that.
And actually, when American U became a depository, he signed the certificate that we had.
That's another thing that I was involved with, was changing the depository law so that law libraries could be, by broadening the definition of who could be a depository. Gosh, that was back in the 70s, wasn't it?
I think it was,
76,
but it was
78?
a huge change and very useful.
Yeah, I remember working on that. In fact, I testified before a congressional committee about that, because we wanted the Michigan Law Library to become a depository, and our congressional representative was very helpful
Yeah.
in getting that
Well,
accomplished.
that was a big undertaking. I remember you worked with some of the luminaries of the time, like Marion Gallagher
Yep.
was involved in
Yeah.
that for years.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
for the same reason, there was a
Mhm.
depository at the University of Washington where she was
Yep.
law
Mhm.
library director. But
Not
they
in the-
needed the stuff, some of the stuff in the law
Mm-hmm.
library, and she had to buy it.
Mhm.
But with the depository rules, she had better access, and some of the cost was, could be used for other things.
Right, and one of the major benefits of being a depository is that you had more certainty of getting the material. Often when you weren't a depository, by the time you even tried to buy it, it was gone.
Yeah, that was a concern I heard her express as well,
Mhm.
the frustration that there were things they wanted to have, but they couldn't.
Yeah.
Of course, we could have them on campus, but it
Right,
wasn't
not
quite
the
the
same
same
thing.
thing.
Right,
Yeah, and so that was,
Mhm.
I mean, that's a
yeah, I had forgotten
a
about that.
real
Thank you for
major
reminding
thing,
me
and
about
you did all that work long before you had a Washington Affairs office.
Right, yeah.
Good. Well, you've had an interesting career in a
I
lot
sure
of
did.
ways.
I sure did.
You're also a writer, a
Oh,
publisher.
Yes.
And could you talk a bit about that? I know you have sitting next to you a book. If you can hold it up sort of near your around there and let the camera see it real well. And then jump out from behind it and tell us a little bit about that and some of your other stuff.
Yeah, when I went to Michigan in 1973, there was a vault. Yes, there was a walk-in vault in my office, and I decided I wanted to see what was in the vault. So I went in there and looked around, and there was stuff. And there was a box, a cardboard box. It was about this big, and it was heavy. And it being a vault, I thought, well, maybe it's full of gold or something wonderful.
You hoped.
I hoped. So I took it to my desk, and I opened it up and took the paper out of the top and discovered in the box the head of a man. It was black, it was metal, and I found out later, or I figured out, that it was the next stage before the creation of a bust of a man's head. And I recognized it as the same as the one that was in the reading room at the Michigan Law Library. It was the death mask of William Cook, the donor of the law quad. And from that death mask, they had created the bust that was in the reading room. So I started asking my colleagues, Cook, who's Cook? I know this is the William W. Cook Legal Research Library, but who was he? And pretty much nobody knew. They said, well, he wasn't very nice. He was prejudiced. He was prickly. I said, well, how did he earn his money? Well, I don't know. He worked in New York. Well, why did he give it all to Michigan? Well, nobody knew. How much money was it? Nobody knew. So I, at that point, which was 1973, tucked away in the back of my mind the idea that I wanted to find out who he was. And by the by the early 2000s, I realized that I had time to do this, probably around 2005. So I started researching his life and discovered that he, luckily, was a fascinating man. I often say that if I hadn't been lucky to have him be an interesting man, he would have made a fortune in a big law firm on Wall Street and would have died on the golf course in Scarsdale, leaving 3 children. But he was not that kind of person. He was a workaholic. He wrote the leading book on corporation law that went into, I think, 8 editions, multi-volume, Cook on Corporations. Worked for one of the first trans-global communication companies. It was a cable and telegraph company. And his company was actually the first one to send a cable and telegraph all the way around the globe. The owner of his company and Teddy Roosevelt did that from Teddy Roosevelt's home on Long Island. He left a tremendous fortune to Michigan. Today it would be worth about $300 million, the value of what he gave to Michigan. But I'm not allowed to say that he's the largest donor ever to the University of Michigan, because that would be rude to the many, many generous people who've given
Still,
money
he
since.
must be one where you have a lot of respect for what he did.
Absolutely. And so he first gave a women's dormitory to Michigan that was opened in 1915, and then after many years of negotiation, he agreed that he would provide a men's dormitory, which turned into the Lawyers Club at the Michigan Law Quad. And then the president of the university talked him into giving the entire law quadrangle, a full square block of collegiate Gothic buildings, all of which he paid for. And when he died, he left everything to the University of Michigan, including a very significant amount of money to support faculty research. So doing the research for the book was a big adventure. It's kind of like your adventure, going around the country, meeting people and doing these interviews. I went to the hunting club that he belonged to in eastern Pennsylvania. I went to the 100-acre estate that he owned at his death on the border between New York and Connecticut, just west of Greenwich, Connecticut. Very
The
high
higher rent part of the
high above
States.
country to this day.
Yeah.
What was his estate now has on it a high school, a junior high school, a 3-story office building, and a 300-unit condominium project of townhouses, not apartments, but townhouses. So it was huge. And he was a very successful man, he was a very generous man. And the story of his gift is not only inspirational, but it's historical because he was the person who articulated the concept that the University of Michigan cannot achieve its greatest potential if it only relies on the taxpayer. The people who benefit from going to school at the University of Michigan should help it achieve its greatest benefit. And his will actually says that he wants to, he doesn't use the word model, but he says, I want to demonstrate the need for people to do what I'm doing in giving my estate to the University of Michigan Law School. So he was also prejudiced and prickly, but he was generous and...
I mean, I don't know the years he was active, but that was probably pretty typical of...
It was very, very typical. And many of the reviews of this book, not that there have been that many, but several of the reviews of my biography of Cook, which is called Giving It All Away, they criticized me as being apologetic for his racism or nativism. And he thrived from about 1885 to 1920 when he retired, and he spent the last 10 years of his life writing a book called American Institutions, which is 2 volumes. One volume is 1 chapter each on every ethnic group that there is. And yeah, you can look at it now and say he was prejudiced and he was racist or anti-Semitic, which is the term that's usually used for him. But if you read it carefully, you notice 2 things. One is the majority of Americans agreed with what he thought. They thought the way he did, and you can see the evidence of that in the 2 pieces of immigration legislation that were passed in the 1920s. You can see the same ranking of races from the best, which are the Anglos, of course, down to the worst, which are the darkest skin. You can see exactly that same ranking of races in congressional committee reports. So he was...
Well, society was very, very different then. I mean, we've seen tremendous changes in our working lives in that area, but it wasn't that far back.
No, it wasn't. And the Americans elected presidents who felt that way, Coolidge, and the Congress passed laws, and our universities were filled with people whose academic work supported those concepts. And it's not fair to judge someone who's been dead for 84 years by today's standards. That's called presentism, and it's a very narrow intellectual approach to anything. And so I get very irritated when people call me an apologist. I'm not apologizing. I'm not saying it's right. I'm just saying it made sense at the time.
Yeah. Well, even today, I mean, here we're in the year 2014, and one of the huge issues in political circles right now is immigration, primarily from Mexico, Honduras, places to the south, and the people coming in are people with darker skin often, and this is, as I say, very controversial. There are differences, very strongly held differences of opinion as to how we should approach responding to
Mhm.
those folks that want to come here.
Right, right.
And it's not an easy thing.
Yeah.
And,
And that similarity to controversies today is one of the things that makes me fascinated studying history. How have we dealt with these problems in the past?
yeah, and yet some
Have
of
we
us
learned
would
anything?
pretend that that was a very different and very bad
Right, right.
situation, yeah.
Mhm.
You wonder what 100 years from now are those who are around will think of our era.
Right.
Who knows?
Yeah.
Well, it'll be after I'm off.
Yeah.
I'm no longer part of it, so
Yeah.
I guess I shouldn't worry. You have engaged in scholarship. I mean, this sounds like it was a fascinating project. You enjoyed doing it. You
Uh-huh.
went out and found information that, you started off, well, what do you do for a living? Well, we don't really know much about it, except he's a
Right.
crusty type guy.
Right. One of the fascinating things about my research is I was doing it right when a lot was becoming more digitized. For
Mhm.
example, newspapers, the ProQuest historical papers were very, very helpful to me.
Oh.
The ProQuest also has in the same as the historical newspapers collection, there's reports from corporations, and that includes the company that he worked for. So every time I would do my searches, I would find more, which made it hard to stop, of course. So it was, and I met wonderful people. I dug into historical societies, old maps. It was just an adventure of its own. And I'm really, really glad that I did it. I also learned that if you're going to expect somebody to pay money to read what you've written, you can't write like a lawyer and you can't write like a policymaker that is a library director. You cannot say, it's just not right. You're not writing policy in practice. You're writing an interesting story. And so I took a lot of classes online and summer workshops at Antioch and at Kenyon to learn how to be a better writer, to be able to write something that people would pay to read. And that was another side of my adventure. And I've continued that in my retirement. I do a little bit of freelance writing locally, mostly locally. I also have had an article, this does not appear on my resume, Pat, so this will be a surprise to you. I've also had an article published in Cat Fancy magazine.
Cat Fancy
Fancy magazine.
Well, I know you have two, I refer to them as the bosses around the
Yeah,
house.
I do have two
cats.
bosses. Yeah, yep, and you've observed them, and please don't let
They're
people
delightful
know.
animals.
Well, they are, but don't let people know all the places they go. So one of my cats came down with a high fever, and to make a long story short, I discovered that he had acquired a grub in his body that he had acquired from a fly that is a parasite of rabbits. He had apparently caught a rabbit and licked the rabbit and then ingested the egg of this grub, which is very poisonous for cats. So you can read all about it in Cat
Well, they
Fancy.
look very robust, so
They are.
either
They're
the
healthy
veterinarians
now.
were able to take care of the problem.
They were, but you have to watch out for that in cats.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting.
Yeah. I also wrote an article about earthworms as an invasive species, and they're actually considered an invasive species in Minnesota.
Oh, are they?
Yeah.
I thought they were beneficial to everybody.
Well, people think that, but they actually are not native, and can be very harmful to hardwood forests. They're good in a garden. It's true they help break up the soil and so on, but they do harm as well.
So do they get up into the trees or something?
No. In the soil, they worm around in the soil and they change the soil structure.
Oh.
They move things around. They also create tunnels that can take moisture away from the roots of trees.
Oh.
And in Minnesota, they've actually documented that the presence of earthworms has damaged some of the hardwood forests there.
Well, those of us in administration primarily sort of get involved in an awful lot of sort of different aspects of things. But I think you're the first colleague who's ever been able to explain this kind of a thing to me.
Well, don't get me started on white-tailed deer then. That's my current obsession.
Well, I know you're involved here in Civic Association stuff, and you have a hearing, I think, tonight on
There's a public hearing on white-tailed deer. There are those who want to call them, but really, to make another long story short, if you have too many deer in an area, the only way to reduce the population that is legal and safe is by sharpshooting. There's no contraception, there's no sterilization, there's no trap and remove, there's no stinky stuff in fences that will actually
I mean, they won't
work.
let you import a bunch of wolves?
The people with children and small dogs do not want wolves around
Oh.
here, or cougars, but that's,
Cougars would be
cougars
another
would be
predator.
good, cougars
Yeah.
would be good, yeah.
Yeah. Just kitties that are a little larger than the ones that we were talking about a
Yeah.
few moments
Yeah.
ago.
I'm sorry, I'm diverting the conversation. from
Oh, well,
your
that's
script.
part of the fun of these
Okay,
things. But,
okay.
you know, we're sort of nearing the end of today's
Sure.
conversation, Margaret. But is there anything else that we haven't talked about that you would like to mention at this point?
I don't think so. I guess a good way to close would be by repeating my thought that I think I've expressed earlier, which is that I loved my profession, I loved my career. I feel very, very fortunate to have ended up at a wonderful place like the University of Michigan and a city like Ann Arbor. But when I left, because I had been the director and because there was a successor, I deliberately planned my retirement so it didn't have anything to do with what I had done before. And for anyone who's looking at this, who says, what happened to Margaret? What happened to Margaret is not that I decided I didn't like my profession. I just decided it was time for a new volume in my life, and that's what I'm doing. And I don't look back, and I highly value the chance to do this, Pat, because it's given me a chance to do something that I should have done for my own good, which was to look back and say, hey, I did some good things. I made some horrible mistakes, but I did some good things too, and I don't think I would have done that.
Truth be known, we all have that kind of a checkered past.
Sure.
few errors, but
Right.
for the most part, it was
Right.
successful.
Right,
Yeah.
right, so thank you for the opportunity. I
Well,
really
thank
appreciate
you,
it.
and I want to thank you, Margaret Leary, for being with me today and talking to us for our oral history of law librarianship. And in thanking you, I also want to acknowledge that I'm doing it on behalf of our colleagues Michelle Wu, Frank Kodak, and Dick Spinelli, of course, with whom I have the honor of putting together this oral history of law librarianship. And
Fabulous project,
Thank you.
fabulous.